Hello and welcome to the Death and Mortality podcast. My name is Rachel Blood.
I'm Owen Mantz.
And I'm Nyangau.
And today we're going to be exploring death and mortality in various pieces of British literature. So I'm going to be focusing on William Wordsworth, who was an English poet and one of the basically forefathers of the Romantic movement.
I'm going to be focusing on Matthew Arnold, who was an English poet, cultural critic, and worked as an inspector of schools.
And I'm going to be talking about T.S. Eliot, who was a 1948 Nobel Peace Prize winner and the author of the poem The Hollow Man.
And was born in Missouri.
Missouri of all places.
Which I didn't believe until I looked it up 2 minutes ago.
It's like bootleg Mississippi.
So the text from William Wordsworth I'm going to be focusing on is his Ode, Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood. So even though it says in the title that it's about immortality, I really think it's more about the concept of mortality. And he kind of bounces back and forth between mourning the loss of the innocence that he had in his childhood, where, you know, when you're a child, you think that everything lasts forever and everything is beautiful, and you basically think that the world is immortal. You're not concerned about death until it gets way closer. And then he kind of shifts from mourning the loss of that mindset to appreciating the perspective that he's gained with age and realizing that when you're aware of your own mortality, you can appreciate everything more because you understand how short-lived it is.
Arnold likewise recognized something lost. However, both Arnold and Wordsworth place this lost in the context of death. The past is not only lost, but has died, reflecting the mortality of each individual. In lines 56 and 57, Wordsworth says that he asks the question, "Whither has fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory of the dream?" And so they recognize that's something lost in the context or through the lens of death.
Oh, yeah. I feel like my poem, like whereas Rachel's talks about like at the beginning when you're a child and you don't really care about things, yours focuses more on, in my opinion, like middle-aged when you're starting to realize that you're mortal. Mine takes place like sort of at the end of the line, like in that shadowy gray area between like not being fully dead and not being like still alive. And he focuses a lot on just like what happens when you like don't have faith to stick onto and like feeling left behind and not really moving on to like full death.
Mm-hmm. And I think all three of the authors kind of fear something that comes at the end of the line. Like Arnold talks about wandering between the dead world and the non-existent one. Wordsworth talks about the trials of aging. But Eliot is more concerned, I think, with the fact that he doesn't know what comes after death, which is interesting to me.
Yeah. Super literal, like making the setting of this poem just exactly that.
Yeah, he kind of makes it sound in The Hollow Man like he's already in one of Death's kingdoms, I think is the word he uses, but that there's another one that he'll eventually cross over into. But when you cross into that one, no one is going to remember you, which I think is also something he's kind of afraid of.
Yeah.
Definitely that remembering aspect. So I think while Wordsworth looks backwards at youth, Matthew Arnold searches for the future, both acknowledging their mortality but searching for the cure in opposite directions. So Wordsworth focuses on the youth, bringing him closer to nature, while Arnold focuses on the future, liberating kind of the past. And then T.S. Eliot is kind of in between, where he talks about life and death, the past and the future.
Mm-hmm. And I think the part that you touched on about nature, it's kind of this progressive journey where at first he thinks that nature is kind of a constant, and I mean it is, but he thinks that it's bad that humanity is changing because nature doesn't change. And then I think as he gets older, he realizes that nature is literally changing all of the time. So if he's kind of idolizing nature as this ideal thing, then he can't discount the mutability and the mortality that comes with it.
So what you just said reminds me of that liminal space we've often talked about.
Yeah.
Where, right, you've got, you're between two things, you're between two opposites. In lines 72 and 76, T.S. Eliot says, "Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow." And that really sets up that liminal space. One might add between the past and the future, between life and death. So I think that's a connection between all of the poets, where they're trapped in between two things, and they're trying to cope with that.
Yeah, like mine takes place like right after World War II, and he talks a lot about like cultural decay and just like how like Europe isn't what it was before the war, and like things are rapidly changing. I mean, like nature, even today, like nature just isn't interpreted in the same way like Wordsworth would have taken it. And I don't know, I feel like T.S. Eliot really misses the times where nature was like a really big thing and people didn't have to worry about like war and culture and stuff like that.
Yeah. The very first lines of Wordsworth poem 1 through 4, it goes, "So there was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth and every common sight to me did seem apparelled in celestial light." And then in line 9, he said, "The things which I have seen, I now can see no more." So it's kind of lost, like that whole rose-tinted glasses, idealistic lens over the world kind of thing.
Yeah.
But going back to the liminal space thing, I think in Eliot's The Hollow Men, the entire thing kind of takes place in this thing that he's made a physical liminal space because he thinks that, like, wherever he is, like, the aftermath of World War II is literally, like, this is what death looks like. And it's not really a world that's still alive, but it's also not, like, final death. So it's kind of like this weird, almost like purgatory-like thing.
The half of my poem is just like about loss and then faith. And what happens when you just don't have faith, you know? He sees the eyes and he's like, oh shoot, they're just too good. I don't want to look at them, right? They're what I want to become, but I can't be that. And towards the end, you can like see him like quoting like phrases from the Bible. He wants to get connected, but he can't, and things just end in a very quiet, somber, like emotionless way. So yeah, faith is pretty important. Did any of your stuff touch on faith?
Absolutely. Matthew Arnold talked about faith a lot in the stanza of the Grand Chartreuse. He first describes the setting of the monks in the monastery, and he sets up the situation of deep faith, of fasting, of prayer, but then remarks himself how he's lost that faith, how he's been raised by the masters of the mind, line 73, and he's moved away from faith and towards reason, but he still recognizes the value of faith. He still recognizes that the importance of tradition, which he, in a way, he tries to come back to that, but recognizes that he can't and that he has to move forward.
Yeah, one of the things that I think Arnold talks about
is like that kind of eternal remembrance. There is this one line in there where he talks about like how the whole religion surrounding the Greek gods is dead, but people still remember them and will always remember them. And I think Wordsworth similarly kind of thinks that beauty is remembered, and maybe there's this concept that nostalgia is kind of tinted. Like in our memories, we generally only remember the good things. Like there's kind of this golden overlay over our memories that maybe blocks out the things that don't matter as much.
Yeah.
That's also reflected towards the end of Intimations of Immortality, where he says, though inland far we be, our souls have sight of that immortal sea.
Yeah.
Right? And so he's saying, no matter how old we are, no matter how far inland we've gone, we still look back on youth. We still, see youth and hold that.
Yes, exactly. One of the scholarly sources that I looked into about Wordsworth's poem kind of compared Wordsworth growing up, or anyone growing up, to be like Adam leaving the garden and kind of the fall of humanity. But then one of the quotes says, although Adam is denied immortality, he retains these intimations of immortality from the bliss of innocence that he once enjoyed in Eden, or in this case, childhood. So like because he's experienced that positivity and that bliss and kind of the previous belief he had in the eternal, he can kind of bring it into the new perspective he has, where even though he recognizes immortality, he remembers what it's like not to.
That kind of relates to your prior point with kind of that purgatory, right? Trapped between realizing youth and now being out of youth, but holding to that. I also found a scholarly source about Matthew Arnold in connection with that tension between the past and the future, where they said that much of Arnold's poetry is animated by that tension, of that liminal space. And they said that there's a lot of antithetical forces and conflicting desires, such as energy and exhaustion, changing continuity. And I think that's seen in all three of these authors, where they're focusing on the change. They're focusing on what's different, but also what is the same.
Mm-hmm. And kind of what's left over. One of the last lines in Wordsworth's is, "Though nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass, of glory in the flower, we will grieve not, rather find strength in what remains behind," which I think is kind of a good way to encapsulate his whole main concept.
Yeah, I fully agree with that, but I feel like at some point you have to just move on. Because in my poem, it made it pretty clear that the place that the group of people were in, it was just not a very good place. You got like scraggly looking, is that a word? Scraggly? You got like rough looking canyons and valleys, and you got cactuses everywhere. It's like not a very good place that doesn't change very often. And they were just not having it there. They wanted change, but they just couldn't do anything about it because they were like motionless. They were like stuffed straw. So I feel like, in a sense, like you need change, whether you like it or not. Change is necessary.
And I think one of the things that kind of creates that mood in Eliot's poem, at least, is the fact that everyone who's still alive has witnessed so much death. So there's also that whole idea of like, how does death affect the people who are still living?
Yeah.
And not only that, but a loss of hope.
Yes.
That, they've not only lost other people, but they've lost their own hope in living.
Mm-hmm. There's all of this death of things that aren't really alive, like the death of nature, the death of certain time periods, and all of this rapid change.
Death of the self.
Yeah. So there's all this loss and like death of non-personified objects, which I think is really prevalent.
Yeah, but they really can't die themselves, which is, they just want to move on.
Yeah.
Well, I think in some ways it's worse not being able to die.
Yeah.
In situations like that, right? Where it's instead of dying, their self or their individuality dies, but they must live on.
Mm-hmm.
Really, because like I feel like I wouldn't mind being fully immortal as long as it just wasn't like Earth. You know what I'm saying?
Not Earth.
Yeah, I don't know. Like being,
so now we have aliens.
No. I mean, like being immortal in heaven sounds like pretty nice.
Oh,
but like
well,
being stuck on Earth, being immortal, just doesn't seem like the move.
Yeah, that does
got,
not
like,
sound ideal.
Nature collapsing around you. You've got like depressed old people telling you that you can't goof around because you're 21. You know what I'm saying? It's just not the move.
There's this one part where Arnold is describing
Like the whole environment that the monks are in. He just really casually mentions that those wooden planks they sleep on are also their coffins. And then he like doesn't linger on it at all. He's just like, oh yeah, and then they'll die here. So it's almost like their death is less significant, maybe because they've dedicated their whole lives to one pursuit, but I feel like his attitude toward them is really strange.
I think Hopkins is interesting because not only does he mention or allude to death, but he explicitly, at least in the Terrible Sonnets, he talks about the death of the self in relation to God, right? So you have to, in a way, die to yourself in order to have that relationship with God, which is just, I think, one of the basic Christian tenets.
Yeah. You have to be lost in order to be found again, because if you don't experience things as worse, you don't recognize when they're better.
Right.
Kind of like in Eliot's, I don't think he's very concerned about when he actually dies, because the world he's seen is already so ruined. He's like, how could it be worse than this? And the only thing that's actually scary to him is that he doesn't know.
Yeah, like people will just like move on and like forget about him.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's pursuing sort of like immortality in the sense where he just doesn't want to be forgotten, being remembered. But that's the thing, right? Do you want people to remember you forever? Because like when you remember things back, like you said before, they just get changed with a rosy tint. You look back at things being better.
What's interesting, though, is that in Eliot's, he talks about how, like, the people who have died, they're remembered as not violent, but hollow. Like, the fact that it's called the hollow men, that's how people remember the people who have died. So they kind of just become these really impersonal beings. So, like, how differently do we remember things after they're gone? You know, and how long does it take for us to alter them in our minds to become something positive?
Yeah, it doesn't feel authentic anymore. Kind of makes me want to like not remember people. That's pretty rude. So,
well, I think Eliot is trying to connect with both Ernest Becker and Heidegger's philosophical ideas, where we don't truly live because we're always in the fear of dying. We're always in the fear of death, and so we can't truly live, right? And so I think he called it the hollow men because we are hollow, because there's always that impending fear of imminent death, and we live our lives with that always in sight. And so once we stop fearing death, I think that's when we truly begin to live.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Elliot is reflecting that idea.
Really, because I actually believe the opposite. I feel like our fear of death is what gives us ambition to actually do stuff, right? As soon as we like conquer cancer and like disease and stuff like that, and we can like live forever, I feel like that's when we truly become hollow, because what motivation is there to do anything, right?
Well, in the last couple lines of the Hollow Men, right, Eliot says, "For thine is life is, for thine is the," but the sentence, the idea, is always cut short, and that's because the speaker is in fear of death, and so there's a loss of hope, there's a fear of death, and that begs the question, like, how can I move forward? How can I, to connect with Arnold, how can I grow another ground? How can we flower in foreign air?
Yeah, I think Wordsworth kind of connects with what Colin said a little bit more, in the fact that, at least in the second half of the poem, he realizes, oh, someday I'm going to die, so I have to take advantage of this while I am here. And that's kind of how he becomes re-enchanted with the world after becoming so disenchanted from it. And he starts the poem with the end of his other poem, My Heart Leaped Up. And in that one, it's very short, and it's basically like, I loved rainbows when I was a kid, and now I see another one, and I refuse to lose the childlike wonder of seeing a rainbow, because I'm going to die soon. And so I feel like the Immortality Ode is kind of just a really long, roundabout thought process of getting to that same conclusion.
Like I feel like life loses all meaning if you can't die.
Yeah,
It's like
it does.
I would agree with that, yeah.
you pursue everything in like the fear of death. So like once you die, it's like you get to move on to hopefully more life, enjoying like your time in heaven or hell, depending on like your past decisions.
I think what these three authors are saying, that they're not saying that life would have more meaning if there was no death. I think they're definitely affirming that life has meaning because of death, but I think they're trying to make the point that instead of denying death, instead of turning a blind eye, we should recognize it, we should understand it, we should notice and really understand that we are going to die, and that our death is imminent and will happen. And only through that recognition can you truly live.
Yeah.
One of those scholarly sources that I looked at talked about how Wordsworth Ode isn't about immortality as much as it is about mortality, but as a complement to immortality, because it's kind of this dual existence, like you can't have one without the other. So immortality implies mortality. And I think there's a lot of kind of dualism in the way that he thinks.
Especially in contrasting himself with nature, where nature seems immortal. It seems, right, the rainbow that he saw as a kid is still there, and it hasn't changed, whereas he has.
Which is interesting, because in Tintern Abbey, the whole idea is that he went back to this place that he was when he was a kid, and it's not the same. Like, now it's ruins. So I think there are some points where he does recognize that nature isn't necessarily immortal either, or at least it will always be there, but it's not the same.
Yeah. Yeah, so immortal with change rather than staying constant.
Yeah. Because I don't think that mutability and mortality are necessarily exclusive concepts.
Right. However, I do think there's the difference between us and nature, where in nature, mutability doesn't mean death. But I think with us as people, it's a little bit different, where we do change, and because we change, we will die. But that doesn't mean that change is a bad thing. Change is actually really good, because although Wordsworth is moving from youth to now an adult, he's going through that change. He's experienced more. He's learned more. He's gained more insight about himself than if he hadn't changed.
There's always that shift in perspective, I think, and that's why we keep going back to these poems, especially, I think, in Eliot. The big obvious change is like he's just gone through a war, so he's not going to be the same person that he was before.
Yeah.
Same with Arnold, too, moving from reason, seeing the faith and kind of having that internal process of trying to reconcile both. How can I have faith and tradition with reason, with rationality? How can I move forward in light of the past?
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, and Wordsworth definitely does that too, kind of using that window into his childhood to remember immortality, but also recognize that it's not, for him at least, as a person, not real.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's funny how they went from like being like the stereotypical rosy, bright-eyed poets to like more like postmodernist kind of like, I don't know.
yeah, I think that entire thing where, Wordsworth's whole arc of becoming his entire view on the French Revolution just totally shifts.
Yeah, it's insane.
That's an interesting point that you made, where each of the authors kind of takes a darker turn. Where Eliot, after the war, he writes really dark, but so does Wordsworth after losing his youth, and so does Arnold when he recognizes that loss of tradition.
I think almost every poet we've read kind of goes through that positive, negative, return to positive.
Yeah.
Which I think is why we keep going back to them, because if there's not that progression, it's just kind of stagnant. And why would we keep returning to literature that doesn't teach us about change,
Right. Back to that change is good concept. Yeah.
So far, what I've learned is change is bad. Morality is nothing more than a figment of your imagination.
Morality or mortality?
Mortality isn't real, and I am more depressed than ever. So far, these poems have done nothing but affirm my depression. Thank you.
So I think what all three of these authors have in common is, one, the loss of hope, the loss of the self in relation to the past. I think another thing they have in common is the concept of death, recognizing death and recognizing its importance to life and living a better life. And then three, the concept of change and the contrast of that change with continuity. So what stays the same? What changes? How is the past influence the future, and how does the future change the past as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good way to sum it up. So I think with that, we're going to conclude this episode of
Death and
Death and Mortality podcast. Woo! Thank you for listening.